I'd always known the job as a delivery driver could be unpredictable, but I never imagined it could get this bad. It was one of those quiet nights when I was assigned a last-minute delivery. I had been on the job for a few months, doing regular routes in and around the city, delivering packages and parcels to every corner of town. Most of my deliveries were easy, in and out, drop the package, get a signature, move on. But this one, well, it was different. The address was in an isolated part of town, somewhere on the outskirts. The map I received on my phone wasn't much help. It looked like a rural area, but still I thought nothing of it. I'd been out to these places before, and while it was a little creepy sometimes, it wasn't enough to deter me. After all, it was my job. I pulled up to the address, a small house nestled at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense trees. There was something off about the place. The lights were on in the house, but there was no car in the driveway. The house looked almost abandoned, but there was that light flickering in the window, as if someone was waiting for me. I parked the van in front of the house and double-checked the delivery information. The name on the order was unfamiliar, something generic, like John Smith. I didn't question it. I grabbed the package, a large box wrapped in brown paper, and walked up the creaky wooden steps to the porch. I knocked on the door. There was no response. I knocked again, this time louder. The silence was thick. Something about the stillness felt wrong. I glanced around, feeling the weight of the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Then I heard it. Footsteps from inside the house. At first they were faint, but then they grew louder, moving closer to the door. I stood there, watching the door handle turn, and as it creaked open, I was faced with the strangest man I'd ever seen. He was tall, gaunt, with sharp features that looked almost skeletal. His eyes were wide, too wide, almost like he hadn't blinked in days. His clothes were old, the kind you might see in an old-timey movie, a long coat that seemed out of place for the season. He didn't speak a word, just stood there staring at me, his eyes flicking down to the package in my hands and then back to my face. I couldn't make sense of it, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as though every action was calculated. I held out the package, asking if he was the one who'd ordered it. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze never leaving mine. After a moment, he nodded slowly and took the package from my hands, but as he did, his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was cold, unnaturally cold, and I recoiled, suddenly aware of how much I wanted to get away from this place. He finally whispered, "Thank you," his voice barely audible. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could take a step, I heard something. A faint noise from behind me, like something scraping across the floor inside the house. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I wasn't sure what I heard, but I was sure it wasn't just the wind. I turned back to the man, who was already closing the door, his movements swift, almost robotic. He didn't seem to notice me standing there anymore. I could see the faint outline of someone else moving in the shadows through the crack in the door, someone tall, with a hunched back. I didn't want to stick around any longer. Something about this place felt wrong, like I had stumbled into a scene that wasn't meant for me. I turned and hurried back to my van, but as I got to the driver's side door, I noticed something strange. The van wasn't parked where I had left it. It had moved. It was now about 10 feet away, positioned differently from where I had parked it. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I had parked a little farther from the house than I thought, but deep down I knew it wasn't me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced around, and I saw a shadow move across the window of the house. It wasn't the man who had taken the package. This shadow was larger, more imposing. I could feel my pulse quicken as the shadow moved closer to the door, but I couldn't bring myself to look back at the house again. I jumped into the van, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was about to drive away when I noticed something else. The box I had just delivered, the one I'd handed to the man, was sitting on the passenger seat next to me. I hadn't brought it in with me. I was sure of it. The cold grip of fear clenched my stomach as I stared at it, the package now open, revealing a strange, almost liquid substance leaking from the sides. Before I could react, I felt the van shift. It was as if the entire vehicle was being pulled in a direction against my will, as though something invisible was guiding me. Panic set in, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but it didn't matter. The van sped down the dirt road with increasing force, as though the road itself was changing beneath me, bending in ways I couldn't comprehend. I slammed on the brakes, hoping to stop whatever was happening, but the van didn't stop. It kept going, hurtling down the road, as though someone or something was controlling it. The sky above me grew darker, the air colder, and the once quiet neighborhood disappeared entirely. I wasn't driving anymore. The road had taken on an unfamiliar, twisted appearance, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Finally, the van screeched to a halt in the middle of nowhere, the road fading into a dense fog. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe as I sat frozen behind the wheel. The radio crackled to life, blasting a distorted voice that seemed to say something unintelligible. And in the rearview mirror, I saw the figure of the man standing in the distance, his eyes now glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. Without thinking, I flung open the door and bolted into the fog, running as fast as I could, far from whatever had just happened. I didn't look back, but I could still feel the presence, something following me, moving through the mist, getting closer with every step I took. I haven't made a delivery to that area since. I had been working as a courier for a few years, taking on deliveries across the city and suburbs, getting familiar with different neighborhoods and their quirks. Most of my route was easy enough, people who were pleasant and didn't mind small talk while they signed for their packages. But then there was this one delivery that made me question everything. It started like any other, with a package assigned to me at the start of my shift. The address was for a small, seemingly normal apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The name was one I didn't recognize, but I didn't give it much thought. I was used to strange names on deliveries. What stuck out, however, was the timing of the order. It was an evening delivery, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. It felt like a routine job at first, but something was off as I neared the building. I pulled up to the curb and parked my van. The complex was quiet, too quiet. There were no cars in the parking lot, no lights on in any of the windows. The street lights flickered as I got out, making the place seem even more desolate. The air was chilly, and it felt like the entire neighborhood had been abandoned. I shrugged off the unease and grabbed the package from the back of the van. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed the building seemed much older than it appeared from the street. The brick had worn down, and the windows were streaked with grime, as if no one had bothered to clean them for years. The door itself looked heavy, made of dark wood, and it creaked when I pushed it open. Stepping inside, I was greeted by silence, a deep, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I called out to see if anyone was around, but my voice echoed in the empty halls. No response. I checked the apartment number on the package again, apartment 3 billion, and made my way up the narrow staircase. The stairwell had an eerie atmosphere, with the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and the dim light from the ceiling barely illuminating the steps ahead. I reached the second floor, and as I turned the corner I saw the door to 3 billion. The number was worn down, barely legible, but still there. I knocked softly, but no one answered. Something about this felt wrong, but I convinced myself to just leave the package at the door and get out of there. As I bent down to set it on the ground, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. It wasn't the sound of someone running or rushing toward me, but the kind of pace that suggested they were taking their time, almost as if they were expecting me. I straightened up and turned around. Standing at the far end of the hall was a woman, tall, with long dark hair that fell over her shoulders, obscuring most of her face. She was dressed in a faded white dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in another time period. The odd thing was that she was staring at me, but her face was hidden beneath her hair, as if she hadn't moved in a long while. I wasn't sure if she was the person I was supposed to deliver the package to, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, motionless. I took a cautious step forward, but as I did, the woman slowly tilted her head to the side, her hair swaying, revealing her face. It wasn't what I was expecting. Her face was pale, almost sickly white, and her eyes were wide, empty, hollow. There was something wrong with them, something unnatural. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The silence stretched on, but instead of speaking, the woman slowly raised a hand, pointing at the package in my arms. Her gaze never left me. There was something so strange about it, so detached, like I wasn't even really there. Her finger trembled slightly as she pointed at the package, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Something in my gut told me to leave. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like I was in danger. Without thinking, I stepped back, turning to leave. But before I could even get halfway down the stairs, I heard a loud bang behind me, like something crashing to the floor. I whirled around, but there was no one in the hallway. The door to apartment 3 billion was shut tight, and the woman was gone. I stood there, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. The whole building felt like it had shifted in the time I'd been inside. The air was heavier now, thicker, like something was pressing down on me. I grabbed the package and ran down the rest of the stairs, desperate to leave, desperate to escape whatever had just happened. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned in my hand, but the door was locked, bolted from the outside. Panic rose within me as I banged on the door, hoping someone would hear me. I turned back, scanning the apartment complex, but there was no one in sight. Everything was still. It felt like hours before the door finally opened. A man stood there, wearing a uniform that looked like he was part of the building's maintenance crew. He looked at me with a strange, unreadable expression and asked if I was okay. I didn't know how to respond, still shaken by what I had just experienced. Without saying another word, he stepped aside, allowing me to exit. As I hurried to my van, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder. But when I did, the complex was silent again, too silent. No one was there. I slammed the van door shut and started the engine, speeding away from the building without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about the experience. There was no logical explanation for what happened, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But I knew what I felt, what I saw. I never went back to that building, and I made sure to check the address carefully for the rest of my deliveries. The whole encounter remained with me, and even though I didn't talk about it, I couldn't shake the memory of those empty eyes, or the feeling that I had barely escaped something far worse. The job as a delivery driver had always been mundane for me, a simple way to make ends meet while I figured out my next steps. Most days I would follow the same routes, deliver packages, and return home without much of a fuss. But one particular night, I'll never forget what happened on my shift. It all started when I was assigned a late-night delivery to a remote area in the outskirts of town. The address seemed unusual, tucked away at the edge of a rural neighborhood, far beyond the more populated parts. Normally, these kinds of orders would be scheduled for the daytime, but this one was specifically requested to be delivered at night. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another late-night request. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with thick clouds rolling in and rain beginning to fall as I loaded the delivery van with the parcels. I checked the GPS on my phone, noting that the destination was a good 30 minutes out of my usual range. With a sigh, I set out, hoping the rain wouldn't get too bad as I made my way toward the address. The drive was uneventful at first, but as I got farther out into the countryside, the roads became narrower and more winding. The trees on either side of the road stood tall, their branches heavy with rain. The air felt dense, almost suffocating. The further I drove, the more isolated everything seemed. There were no other cars in sight, and the streetlights were few and far between. The kind of place where you wouldn't want to break down in the middle of the night. I had a strange feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, but I chalked it up to the solitude of the place. Still, something about the area seemed off. The houses I passed were old, many of them abandoned, their windows dark and empty. As I pulled onto a dirt road, the only thing I could hear was the rhythmic sound of my tires against the wet gravel. When I arrived at the address, I found an old farmhouse sitting at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. The lights in the house were dim, and there was no sign of movement. I got out of the van and grabbed the package, checking the label one last time. This was definitely the right place. But why was it so quiet? I walked up the front steps, my footsteps muffled by the wet ground, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I knocked again, a bit louder this time, but still no response. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to leave the package at the door or wait. The feeling in the pit of my stomach was growing stronger. Suddenly I heard a sound from behind me, something faint but unmistakable. The rustling of leaves, followed by soft footsteps. I turned around expecting to see someone walking up the driveway, but there was no one in sight. The wind howled through the trees, making the whole area feel even more desolate. I turned back toward the house and knocked once more, but this time the door creaked open slightly on its own. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap. Should I go in? The thought crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. It wasn't my job to enter the house. I had a delivery to make, and that's all. I pushed the door open a little wider, calling out to see if anyone was home. Still no answer. But then, as I stood there, I noticed something strange. A faint light seemed to be flickering from within the house, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The light was coming from the living room, where I could just make out the shape of an old lamp swaying slightly, as if someone had been sitting there only moments before. I stepped into the doorway, still unsure of what to do, when the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. My heart nearly stopped in my chest, and I spun around in panic, but the door was locked from the inside. I pounded on it, trying to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. The house felt colder now, the air thick and heavy. The silence was suffocating. I stood there, trying to control my breathing, but the sense of dread only seemed to grow stronger. I called out again, but the words were swallowed by the silence. The house was now completely still, with no signs of life. I took a step back, looking around the darkened living room. The walls were lined with old photographs, and the furniture was covered in dust. A broken mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting a dim, flickering light. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something in the corner of the room, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, obscured by the darkness, and its outline was unnervingly still. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. My mind raced with thoughts of possible explanations. Maybe it was a mannequin, or some kind of strange decoration, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching me. The longer I stared at it, the more real it seemed. It wasn't just a shadow or trick of the light. It was something that shouldn't have been there. Without thinking, I backed away slowly, inching toward the door. But the moment I turned around, I heard a creaking sound from behind me, the sound of footsteps following my every move. I whipped around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to leave. I bolted for the door again, desperate to get out of the house. But when I reached the door, It was still locked. I pounded on it again, but no one answered. The feeling of being trapped overwhelmed me, and for the first time I feared I might never leave. With no other option, I grabbed the package and sprinted for the window. It was a small, cracked window, but with all my strength I managed to push it open. The rain was coming down harder now, but I didn't care. I climbed out of the window and ran back to the van, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that farmhouse, my pulse still racing, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. I never spoke of it to anyone, not even my coworkers. It was a delivery that went far beyond the strange and into something darker, something that should have never been part of my route. I had been working as a delivery driver for just under a year. Mostly I made standard deliveries around the city, easy drops at apartment buildings, suburban homes, and sometimes businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. That all changed one night when I received an unusual late-night delivery request. The delivery was to a remote area about 2 hours outside of town, at the very edge of the mountains. It was marked as urgent, and the company instructed me to get the package delivered as soon as possible. I was skeptical from the start. Who would need a package at this time of night, in such an isolated area? But I wasn't in a position to question it, so I took the job, figuring I would get in, drop the package, and leave. The drive started off normal, the familiar city lights disappearing as I ventured farther from town. The roads began to wind, the night air cool and still. As the rain started to fall lightly, I noticed the GPS taking me further off the main highway. The pavement gave way to dirt roads, and the trees grew denser, almost like the forest was swallowing the path. I wasn't concerned at first, but the further I drove, the more uneasy I became. There was no sign of life for miles, no other cars, no lights, just the sound of the rain against my windshield and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I kept glancing at the GPS, reassuring myself that I was on the right track, but the feeling in my gut kept getting worse. After about an hour of driving down this isolated path, the GPS took me off the road completely, directing me onto a narrow, overgrown trail. I hesitated, but the thought of completing the delivery and getting back to the city kept me moving forward. Eventually, I reached a clearing where an old, dilapidated farmhouse stood. It wasn't much more than a shell of a building, with broken windows and the remnants of a porch sagging under the weight of neglect. My headlights barely illuminated the structure, and there was no sign of movement. It felt like no one had lived there in years, but I wasn't in a position to turn back. I had a job to do. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I felt the air grow colder. The wind picked up, and a sudden chill washed over me, making my skin prickle. I grabbed the package from the passenger seat and walked up to the front door. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I looked through the cracked windows, trying to see if anyone was inside, but all I could make out was a dim light flickering inside. It seemed to move, like it was swaying, but there was no obvious source of it. That's when I noticed something strange, a shadow moving past one of the windows, just out of my view. My heart skipped a beat. I figured it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light, but the unease I'd been feeling was turning into genuine fear now. I stepped back from the door, staring at the house, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But before I could gather myself, I heard a faint sound behind me, a rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. The woods surrounding the house were still, save for the wind rustling through the trees. I chalked it up to my nerves getting the better of me, but I knew I had to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that I wasn't supposed to be here. As I turned to go back to the truck, the air grew heavier, the silence oppressive. That's when I heard it again, footsteps, but this time they were closer, and they weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from the woods. They were coming from inside the house. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively stepped closer to the truck, ready to jump into the safety of the cab. Suddenly, the door to the house creaked open, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, just out of reach of the light. It was tall, its features hidden by the darkness. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, my breath shallow and quick. I wanted to leave, but I knew I couldn't just walk away without completing the delivery. I hesitated for a moment longer, then forced myself to walk toward the door, feeling my heart pound in my chest. As I stepped closer, the door slammed shut, and I jumped back in fright. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I stared at the door, my mind racing. Who had closed the door, and why? My instincts screamed at me to run. I turned around and bolted for the truck, throwing the package back onto the passenger seat. As I fumbled to start the engine, I glanced back toward the farmhouse, expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the darkness and the trees. The rain began to pour heavily, making the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the path, not daring to look back. But in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw a shadow, just for a second, standing by the house, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that place. I glanced over at the passenger seat where the package still sat, and for the first time I considered abandoning it. But the thought of going back into that area, with the terrifying feeling of being watched, made the decision for me. I returned the package the following morning, the fear still lingering in the back of my mind. To this day, I've never gone back to that area, and I don't know what or who was waiting for me out there in the dark.